In a season of highs and lows, episode 14 The Other Side certainly isn't the worst entry so far. However, it is really quite dull. After what was a surprisingly good episode last week, the pacing this time around is reduced to a crawl, as it's clear that things are now just being set up for the end of season finale. There are two main narrative threads running through this week's episode, with the first being the little road trip that Rosita and Sasha embark on together in an attempt to take down Negan. To cut a long story short, the pair of them manage to make it to a building opposite Negan's sanctuary, where they plan to use a sniper rifle to put a bullet in his head. During this segment, the two girls had a heart-to-heart about Abe, and seemingly settled their differences. I'm guessing that this was supposed to be an emotional moment for the viewer, but to be quite honest, I completely switched off as I was so bored with the conversation that played out between them. It really felt like the writers just forced the characters to make up, just so Rosita can feel guilty when Sasha dies, something that I'll get onto in a moment. Anyway, after not being able to get a shot on Negan when he eventually appeared due to there being too many people around him, Sasha and Rosita decide that the only option is to head inside the base in order to kill him. Why they couldn't just wait another day for him to come back out into the open, I don't know. Although, as you can probably tell, I wasn't a huge fan of this sequence. I did like the fact that the pair of them witnessed Eugene bossing members of the Saviours around. He really seems like he's in his element at Negan's headquarters, and he even got a hug from the big man himself. The radio message that the ladies intercepted from him was also a nice touch and actually made me laugh out loud. I also appreciated seeing Eugene refuse Rosita's offer to help him escape. In fact, he looked positively horrified when Rosita killed one of the men he was talking to, someone who Eugene may have well become friends with during his time there. Although in the eyes of Rosita, Eugene's idea to stay was seen as the ultimate betrayal, personally I think there is little reason for him to want to leave. I mean, he's got it made at Sanctuary, and I thought his decision to stay there was one of the best parts of the episode. Unfortunately, just as things really started to get going, this week's installment came to an abrupt end, but not before Sasha managed to lock Rosita out of the compound, telling her that it wasn't her time before entering it herself on a one-woman suicide mission. At this point, I would be more surprised if Sasha didn't die during the finale. Combine the huge amount of foreshadowing during her last few appearances, and the fact that the actress who plays her has already been cast in a new Star Trek series, and you come to an extremely likely conclusion. I do find it kind of disappointing nowadays that deaths in The Walking Dead seem to be so obvious that they can be seen from a mile away. Deaths in previous seasons genuinely used to shock me. I didn't expect T-Dog and Laurie to die in the same episode, nor did I expect Beth to die at the hospital, or Noah, the guy who was saved instead of her, to die a few episodes later. Now it seems that important characters only ever die during the season premiere or finale. Simply put, it's annoying how predictable The Walking Dead has become. Moving on, the other narrative focus this week involved the Saviours turning up at Hilltop in order to nab themselves a new doctor. Gregory did briefly grow a backbone as he requested to discuss the decision with Simon, who promptly put him back in his place, causing him to back down. I'm sure a lot of viewers will probably accuse Gregory of being a coward for not preventing the loss of his doctor. But when you think about it, Rick is also guilty of doing the exact same thing, as he didn't do anything to prevent Negan taking Daryl or Eugene. I know it's not a particularly important point to make, but I just think it's interesting to note the differences in perception when comparing Rick's actions to Gregory, even though in this instance they were no different to one another. I didn't think there were many standout performances this week, however I thought that Steve Ogg Simon was brilliant as his usual creepy self. I really liked the fact that he was able to manipulate Gregory so easily, even going so far as to convince him that he was his friend, even though in reality he was treating him like shit. I honestly think at times when he's on screen, he can give JDM's Negan a run for his money. Now the last point that I want to talk about is the interaction that took place between Daryl and Maggie, both who took up hiding when the Saviours arrived at Hilltop. On one hand, it was finally nice to see them open up and talk to one another about Glenn, but on the other hand I found their conversation a bit laborious. Whilst I'd admit that on a few occasions in the past I found it a bit irritating how characters who die are completely forgotten about and brushed over within an episode or two, the constant conversations about Glenn and Abraham, who Sasha and Rosita also spoke about, are just getting annoying. Not an episode goes by where a character doesn't seem to mention either of them. Of course I understand that their deaths had a massive impact on the whole of Rick's group, but personally I think it's getting boring constantly listening to characters droning on about them. And to be honest, I find their deaths having less and less impact on me every week because of this. So, to conclude this week's episode, The Other Side was rather mediocre. There were some good moments buried beneath the mundane, but it definitely isn't an episode that I'd be in a rush to view again. The Other Side is kind of similar to how this season has been on the whole, a muddle of some good parts and some not so good. Hopefully the final two installments will contain more good parts than the bad.